All right, welcome back. And in this lecture, I'm going to talk about types of sources, types of support. And this is kind of relevant. I've been writing a paper that I'm trying to publish in an academic research journal. And typically when the first draft comes back to me, I get feedback from the reviewers that says, you need more sources here and here. This is a normal thing for those of us who are publishing papers. It's often the case that we get asked maybe in a couple of places we need another source or two. Like for this point here in the introduction, I was just providing some background information, and I was asked to cite a couple of more sources as examples of this thing. And especially in my case, when I'm in my research, I like to kind of bring different ideas from different theories together. I'm kind of combining things in a really new way. And it's really important that I cite enough sources. So it's always, this is a normal thing in academic writing. Sources. So on page 103 in my book, section 6.1, types of support, I've got just a list of a bunch of different kinds of things that might be considered support. Now, some of these might be types of support you might have used in high school papers. But do these work in college? Some do, some don't. Some of these maybe you've never heard of before and aren't familiar with. Well, we'll talk about some of these today. Well, let's just go through the list here. Authority of scholars. Can you just cite somebody and that person's authority means it's correct? No, certainly not. First of all, especially in like sciences, never. People might quote Einstein, not because Einstein himself it makes it right, but because, his theories, his hypotheses have been tested again and again and always proven true. So you might cite him or a quotation from him just because it's helpful for explaining something, for making a point. But really what is true, or what we want to prove or make the point we're trying to make, it's not because of anybody's authority. Authority never proves anything. That's not how things work in the real world. So authority or quotations from scholars. Here's an example. He's a famous linguist, Noam Chomsky. I don't know if you can see this. The title's not very readable here. He's famous in linguistics and political science, and academic people debate his ideas all the time, like in linguistics. Some people just totally reject everything he says, and some people just love everything he says. And I'm in the middle, because I'm about show me the proof. There's evidence for some things that he says. There's, I think, not evidence for some things that he says. We debate based on, what can we prove through testing, through research? And that's how the real world works and how the academic world works. Sometimes a quotation is maybe more common in humanities writing to include quotations, not to prove something, but just as a way of providing an explanation. But a quotation in itself is not necessarily evidence. And maybe in some humanities writings, quotations are a little more common in order to just explain things, but not necessarily to prove things. And in science, very rarely do people use quotations, and certainly don't rely on anyone's authority in sciences, or even in some of the hard social sciences like psychology research. Next, things like facts and statistics. Yeah, we'll talk more about statistics later. It depends on whether it's from a reliable source. And we'll talk about that later. Same with case studies. If it's from a reliable source, yeah, that might be good support for your paper. Research studies and experiments. Yes, if you can understand them. If you get a research article from an academic research journal, and if you can understand it, yeah, you can read it. Here, let me grab a linguistics journal here. Code switching to L1 in the EFL classroom. It's maybe something you could read and understand. Countability of mass nouns among EFL learners in an Asian context. Sounds interesting. Depending on how much background you have in linguistics, maybe you can understand that. Here's one from a psychology research journal. Let me see here. The multiverse of methods, extending the multiverse analysis to address data collection decisions. Yeah, interesting. Oh, here we go. Here's a good one. A comparison of two neurobiological models of fear and anxiety, a construct validity application. Do you understand that? Nah, probably not. Now, I could probably read that and enjoy it because I have some background in psychology research. Most of you cannot. Do not cite something you cannot understand. If you come across a good research article and you can understand it, yeah, you can cite it. If you don't understand it, don't cite it. Or maybe the abstract you can cite. If you can understand just the abstract, maybe you can cite that. And there are ways of citing just the abstract, not the whole article. Don't pretend you read and understand something really technical that you didn't understand. You'll look dumb later on, trust me. Informal surveys, like by your campus magazine, campus newspaper, or small town newspapers, probably not. If it's a formal research survey by somebody who's trained in business research or academic research and it's in a reliable source, then probably yes. If it's a good survey from a good, reliable source by a proper researcher, yeah. Now, things like personal observations and anecdotes, personal stories. Maybe in high school, okay, but in college, not really. Why? Because one, we're humans, we exaggerate, we interpret things emotionally when we tell stories. Especially if you hear from someone else, it might be filtered through our, people's biases and emotions. And like the classic telephone game, you whisper something in someone's ear and they whisper something in another person's ear and such. And things like informal, anecdotes and stuff like that could be, messed up by the sort of telephone game effect, And even from often from news programs, it may not be reliable. It maybe is, maybe not. You have to be careful. Interviews, same thing. It's if it's an expert interview, one expert interview and another expert, maybe in a college paper. If it's in a good source, maybe. But you have to keep in mind that, if I'm being interviewed about something where I'm an expert, the interview format just doesn't allow you time to properly organize your thoughts and think and gather the data and such, and maybe give a good response. So maybe in some fields, expert interviews might be valid, but be careful. Things like popular sources like blogs, SNS posts, no. General popular books, or what we call trade books. Trade as in they are commercial books. They're published to make money. Most kind of trade books you buy in your bookstore, probably not. Why? Why is that? We'll come back to that later. Why are kind of a lot of commercial trade books not good sources? Well, actually, quick answer, is the writer an expert? Is the writer really a properly trained, experienced expert in the field? With a lot of commercial trade books, probably not. Now, there are books that we'll talk about in a minute that are good. We have kind of academic books. Well, here's this Chomsky book I was showing you. This is really heavy stuff. This is what we call a monograph. It's an academic book on a very specific research topic. And so these are the kinds of books that are written by professors and researchers. Most of you may not be able to, if you're watching this video, if you're in my class, you might not be able to understand most of these monographs. So a monograph is an academic research book on a specific topic. Often reporting new research. Chomsky's Aspects of the Theories of Syntax. Here's another linguist, Metaphors We Live By. This is actually a good book. This one might be more understandable. By George Lakoff, Mark Johnson. Good book. check it out. Here's a heavy one, comprehension. This is by a research psychologist about how people read and process language in their minds. Comprehension, a paradigm for cognition. Most of you probably won't be able to understand it, or it'll probably put you to sleep. I like it, but it's hard to read. So there are monographs which present maybe somebody's original research. And they also kind of look at other research that people have done in the field and summarize them and integrate them with their own analyses. They provide their own analysis and interpretation, and then present some of their own original research ideas or data and analysis. And that's a monograph. Now, a lot of those you might not be able to understand and use if they're really technical. Now, there is a sort of middle category of kind of what I call professional sources. Now, so if you had a writing class before, you may have learned, well, there are academic sources which you cite in college papers, and then there are popular or general sources which you don't cite in college papers, except they might say, well, there are a few popular sources that are better quality. Well, okay, I find this two-way distinction not very useful or practical. One, this middle category is to me is a separate category of its own. And I've talked about trade journals, professional trade journals. That's an example of this professional middle category that I have in my system. I classify things as kind of popular, professional, academic. And the thing about academic sources is, like a lot of this stuff, you might not be able to understand. This stuff, or this stuff, you might not be able to understand if you're a typical college student. If you're a graduate student and this is your field, okay, yeah, you'll be reading this all the time and hopefully loving it. But if you're a college student, unless it's the type of stuff you've read in a third or fourth year college class, if you've read a research article by a scholar or a researcher in, like your third year, fourth year class, a specialty class, like romantic poetry or psycholinguistics or molecular biology. Unless it's one of those kinds of papers you've read in class or something on that level, you might not be able to understand a lot of academic sources. But there is this middle category of professional sources. So for one thing, some of the professional or trade publications, professional periodicals, trade periodicals, I think I've mentioned before, talked about before. And these are periodicals kind of written by experts for other people who are not necessarily experts in the field. So for example, and they're often kind of related to specific occupations or fields, kind of more practical in nature, but often grounded in like research. So the writers who are people who are experts, there might be academic experts like experts in education and psychology who are writing articles that are explaining current research and understanding about a topic. Like this is what current research says about the best way to teach grammar in an English classroom, or the best way to discipline children in a middle school, or business experts who talk about, well, this is particular problem you should avoid if you're relying on technology in your company, certain technologies in your company. So these professional sources are written by experts, but they're written for people who are not necessarily experts, but people who are, of course, still educated and need that kind of information. So the examples I showed you before, one was like a psychology trade journal by proper psychologists, and it's articles that kind of explain current research for people in various professions, teachers, counselors, therapists, and people who work in psychology-related fields and education fields of some kind. Then there's this, what I call, another kind of professional source, these kinds of professional books. So these are written by experts. Might be, for example, a business expert, somebody who's worked as a CEO or manager for many years and writes a book about certain aspect of business. So that person is not necessarily a high-level academic expert, but they have a lot of years of experience. They're an expert in the field. So this is a professional source, a business leader who writes a book about, say, management, insights on management style, or insights on customer service, or insights on training your employees. That's one kind of expertise in this middle category of professional sources. Then you have academic experts who write books and articles for non-experts. So let's take Steven Pinker, for example. Here's a name you should know. Here's a famous book of his, The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker. Pinker is a famous cognitive psychologist. So cognitive has to do with cognition. It's from a Latin verb meaning to think. It has to do with thinking processes, mental processes. The study of how we know things, how we understand things, how we perceive things, how we store information in our minds, how we process language and ideas and concepts. So Pinker is a research psychologist, formerly at MIT. He moved down to Harvard for some reason. This is his famous book. He's an expert when he writes on language and cognitive psychology. He's written a lot of these books. This is written at a very educated level. He is an expert. He's writing not so much for professional linguists or research psychologists, but this is really for anybody who's interested, who is an educated person and can read at a college level and is interested in language. Whether you're a linguist or a teacher, an educator, a therapist, or just interested casually in language and how human language works and how language works in the mind. He is an expert on this, but he's writing this including his own ideas and looking at a lot of research over the years to explain things clearly to people who are educated but not experts. And here's another one of his, How the Mind Works, explaining human mind and cognition. Now, of course, he publishes a lot of heavy research articles, which may be a little too technical for you, but you can pick up one of his books. These might be considered trade books, but these are written by experts for educated people. These are definitely at a college reading level, not high school, not middle school, like a lot of commercial trade books. And in recent years, Pinker has kind of developed an interest as a cognitive psychologist into issues of like human nature and society, social issues as a cognitive psychologist, like this. Here's another example. Here's a physicist, a physics professor from Germany, Sabine Hossenfelder. This is a book I hope to read sometime, Lost in Math, and it's about the math behind theoretical physics, the math behind, that makes up our world, our universe. These are definitely books I want to read sometime soon. Well, of course, Pinker's Language Instinct, of course, I read. That's a must-read. Some other examples. Here's another name you should know if you're an English major, How Language Works by David Crystal. Crystal has written a lot of books. He's an English linguistics professor in England. If you ever get a chance to hear him talk at a conference, you should hear him. He's brilliant. He's great to listen to. And he writes a lot of books. As an expert on linguistics, he writes a lot of books for just language people, language educators especially, language learners, about different aspects of language and how language works, language issues. So these are what I call professional sources. These are by experts, but they're not written for other experts at a high level. They're written for non-experts, educated non-experts like us in different fields. Not necessarily high-level expertise. You don't need to be an expert in these fields to understand these books. These are professional sources. Okay. Also on page 103, newspapers. I'll talk about newspapers in a later video. And finally, of course, general reference works, Wikipedia, encyclopedias, dictionary definitions. Don't ever use those in college papers. Technical definitions, yes, but not a dictionary like how a word is used in a very special technical way in a technical field. Yes, but not a dictionary definition. The dictionary defines hope as. Don't do that. Let me look at some questions at the top of page 104. What constitutes informal types of support? Well, again, things that are not by experts. You might have used those in high school, but unless it's by some kind of a proper expert, and it's written for other experts, or at least at a educated level, like at a college level, and it's in a reliable source, then you don't want to use it. If it's not from a reliable source or a reliable expert, then you probably don't want to use it. Differences between anecdotes versus like examples from a study. You might have case studies and interviews by researchers, and researchers, maybe business researchers or academic researchers, who are properly trained in how to do interviews or how to do case studies, and how to record their case studies and interviews objectively without being biased, and they know how to give a proper interpretation or analysis or explanations of their case studies or their interview data. Like I interviewed a subject who said this, and you can use their expertise to give a proper analysis or interpretation of that case study or of what interviewees said in their interviews. Statistics. What qualifies as statistics? Let me show you a famous book, How to Lie with Statistics. This is a classic, not because it's trying to promote lying, but actually it exposes how some people misuse statistics. Politicians, advertisers, businesses misuse statistics to deceive people. And it's easy to do with what we call descriptive statistics. Descriptive statistics would be things like counts, averages, frequency data, how often something happens, average, and things like that. Advertisers, commercials can manipulate those kinds of statistics easily. Politicians can manipulate those kinds of statistics. So sometimes those descriptive statistics are used in some kinds of research, history, language education, things like that, informal language or certain kinds of linguistic studies. It's fine. But when you hear this, like in the internet or from a politician, from an advertisement, you have to be careful, because descriptive statistics can be manipulated, as this book so fabulously describes, How to Lie with Statistics. You should read that. Definitely read this if you want to be an educated citizen. In a lot of heavy research, science, psychology, heavier linguistics research, we use these are not the statistics that we use. We use what's called inferential statistics, and you may have no idea what this is, and that's okay. These are statistical methods you've probably not heard of. T-tests, ANOVAs, correlation, regression, logistic regression, factor analysis, multivariate analysis, HLM, stuff like that, fancy stuff that we use to discern if something is really going on here. If you have like your research group and your control group, is there really difference between these two groups, or is something really happening in the data? You can look at averages, and that won't tell you necessarily if something real is happening in the data when you do an experiment, when you do research. So with descriptive statistics, you have to be careful. If it's inferential statistics, like what you're going to see this like in heavy linguistics and psychology research, science research, economics research. You're probably not ready for that yet. When you see that, you should know that it's probably more reliable, but maybe hard for you to understand. Where can you get good statistics? Maybe the kinds of good descriptive statistics you might use in your college paper. Again, official, good, reliable academic publications will probably have more reliable statistics. Data collected by researchers. Official government websites by government agencies that are in charge of collecting data. Your Ministry of Labor or whatever it's called, collects data on employment and workers and worker data, and companies. The Ministry of Education collects data on public schools and universities and colleges and students and education programs, a lot of educational statistics, research institutes. So statistics, good statistics can come from official government agencies and websites and official researchers, proper research sources, and things like that. Okay, so this is an overview of types of sources. You have popular sources, which you probably won't cite in college papers. You have professional sources, which most likely you'll want to cite in college papers. These are the things you can understand. Professional sources, things like books by experts, articles by experts who are written at a non-technical level, trade journals, and things like that. Then you have academic sources, which are going to be harder to understand. Some of them you won't be able to use or understand, some of them maybe. Depends on you. If you can understand them, go ahead and use them. I'm going to talk more about professional sources in a later video, maybe the next video, particularly in terms of news sources. I want to talk more about news sources and also business news and science news and stuff like that. So I'm going to give you some assignments about something a little bit different, which I'm going to talk about in a later video, but I want you to try it out first. We'll come to that topic later in the videos. For next time, news sources, science news and business news and stuff like that, news outlets, traditional media, and fun stuff like that. So see you in the next video. Goodbye.